Thank you, thank you. So we have one final presentation this evening. I just want to say briefly that Dr. Lori Pierce is a professor in the Department of African and Black Diaspora Studies and is also one of our Social Transformation Research Collaborative's Professional Development Fellows, which means that she had a fellowship very similar to the Center for Latino Research Fellowship, but it also gave her additional funds for summer research. And you're writing on the topic of DNA, I believe, right?
I'm actually not writing, but that's okay. I'll get to that in a second.
No, that's true. Yeah, it wasn't.
No point in having a fancy toy if you don't use a fancy toy. So 10 minutes, there we go. My STRC, and thank you for inviting me to do this. My STRC Faculty Development Fellowship was actually directed at teaching instead of writing. Which is a good thing because I do not want to write about science. I do not want to, no one wants me to write about science. The goal of the research, or the goal of my time off, which was really, I tried to think of it as like studying for qualifying exams, right? So without the bother of having to actually take the exams. So I was trying to take advantage of the time to look into, to kind of investigate questions having to do with DNA and race and the way that we use DNA now as a metaphor for race or talking about race. I started thinking about this for, a lot of things here are 20 years old, including 20 years here this year. Many of us here have been here for 20 years. And I started ever since, this is a survival clap, thank God. I forgot we're being recorded. Since I got here, every quarter, so 2 or 3 times a year, I've been teaching a section of LSP 200, which I forget what it's called now, but it used to be, I forget what it used to be called. My class is called Understanding Race and Racism. And what I've always done in that course is kind of help students to deconstruct the idea of race, what it means, and then in order to come up with a different definition so we can then reconceptualize what racism is. There's no point in continuing to talk about racism as I hate you, you hate me, if we can't talk about the structural processes that are responsible for this. So we redefine race, it's fairly straightforward. We redefine race as social process and then redefine racism. When I started teaching this, I actually was doing a version of this when I was in grad school. So literally I've been doing this since the 20th century. And it sounds more impressive that way. When I started doing this was, the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. And we were at that point in history where finally it was like, oh, thank God we can stop talking about this, right? So science are now saying is like, no, there's no such thing as race. And there's all of this scholarship, both science and social sciences, saying you can stop talking about it now. We know that there are no racial categories, that the racial categories are socially constructed. And, I'd get to the end of that section of the class and I would say, so there we go. No, race is socially constructed. Congratulations. Let's move on. 10 years ago, all of a sudden that just stops being true. If you live long enough, your scholarship stops being relevant. It's like, what happened here? All of a sudden, I have students who are now recapitulating race in a really interesting way. So it happened today. I was teaching my class on mixed race identity. And I forget exactly how we got there because I never know how the course is going to go. And one student said, okay, so wait a minute, what's the difference between DNA and blood? I was like, okay, she did a really interesting thing in using those two bodily metaphors as a way of talking about race, both of which, in her mind, in her mind, she's seeing DNA as something, kind of real or something right or true or correct or current, and blood is this older version, right? That, that's not what it was, it's this thing. And what's actually happening there is both of those things are happening at the same time. She's conflating these two ideas. It wasn't her fault, I'm not blaming her, but she's conflating these two ideas, the ideas of bodily, using bodily, whatever processes, parts, hair, skin, eyes, blood, skulls, knees, they've used everything in order to create racial categories, right? And this has always happened. And so, somewhere along the line, once in the last 10 or 15 years, DNA began to replace all of those categories or begin to supersede them. They all still exist. They all still get used depending on, what you're reading and what class and, where students have experience. But DNA started to take the place, right? DNA all of a sudden, I was thinking, where is this coming from? So the point of the STRC, the time off, what I was trying to do was try to figure out how I could talk about DNA without having to be a scientist. There was no way I was going back to, turns out science is hard, right? It's really hard to learn this stuff. So what I was trying to do was, find resources that we could use together in order to articulate our understanding of race that was more sophisticated than just saying, race is socially constructed, right? It's like, well, that doesn't really help if you don't know who is doing what, right? So socially, society, what's that? Constructed, what's the actual process that's happening? So the point of what I was, focusing on DNA was to, use a contemporary way of talking about this in order to show the reiteration, the recapitulation of race as socially constructed, right? It's easy to think that DNA, like, other kinds of science, once we've gotten to, Watson and Crick in the 1960s and 70s, and now we understand what DNA is and we don't have to think about this. And, by the time we get to 2000, to the Human Genome Project, right? We think science is going to solve the problem of race, and science is actually basically creating it or recreating it. Any scientists in the room, I'm sorry, don't mean to disparage you, but scientists are part of the social construction of race. And we never spend, I don't want to say never, but we rarely get enough time to talk about why that is and how that is, right? Anytime science is creating categories of things based on body and then building on those, that's race. Doesn't matter however else you qualify it, that's always going to be race. So the point, what I was trying to do with the fellowship is learn enough about this so that I didn't have to turn to the CSH student and say, can you explain genomics? Which is what I did several times. It actually works. Some of them are much smarter than I am. But to be able to, like I said, come up with a body of work, come up with ways of talking about this so that I could more competently talk about the problems with DNA as a way of talking about, kind of racial essentialism, right? To really be able to show what's happening in the science, not in any technical way, but just in terms of the kind of framework of how science is working here. Like I said, I started to do this. I was doing this in an LSP 200 class. It kind of comes up in all of my classes. A couple of years ago, I developed a class called Race, Science, and White Supremacy. People don't really like the title, but I think it's cool. Race, Science, and White Supremacy. And the point of that class was to follow the genealogy, to start with the racial taxonomists in the 18th century, get all the way through eugenics, and then being able to make the leap from, because I always wanted to stop at World War II. But to be able to make that next step into the 21st century and to be able to explain, or at least to better understand it. So that's how I got here, and that's what I was using my time for with the STRC. I believe part of what I was doing was looking at DNA and its relationship to ancestry, genealogy, kinship, those kinds of questions. And the other part had to do with kind of forensic use of DNA in forensics and criminal justice, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't actually get as much time as I wanted to with that, because that ancestry stuff is a deep, deep, deep rabbit hole. Oh my God, once you get into that, it's why people spend their lives doing genealogy. It's both fascinating and kind of disturbing in some ways. Has anybody here ever done the ancestry DNA test? You have? Yeah. Okay, I'm very sorry. You no longer have any privacy. You just, sorry about that. Let me tell you just a real quick lesson on how these things work. And they can see both why they're really exciting, right? These DNA tests are both really exciting and also really troubling on some levels. Part of it has to do with the privacy, but part of it has to do with how these things are linked to one another, both the ancestry and the forensics, use of DNA in criminal justice systems. It turns out they're not that far apart. The DNA, if you haven't ever taken one of these tests, and if you haven't, maybe you don't want to do it. If you haven't ever taken one of these tests, everybody's seen the commercial, right? So somebody spits into a vial, and then they get the results, and the next thing you know, they're wearing a kilt and playing bagpipes. Or it's like all of a sudden I'm now this, and the tagline always is find out who you really are, right? Find out who you really are. You don't really know who you are unless you can cosplay some kind of ethnic identity, right? This is race, okay? So we're never that far from trying to find ways of performing race or showing race as some kind of performance. So the easiest thing to do, you show a white person doing it and so they become Irish, they become, Italian or something like that. What the tests do is, like in a, you spit in the tube, everybody knows the process, right? What happens with that sample, and every company is different, right? So there's Ancestry.com, AncestryDNA.com, 23andMe. Do you remember which company used 23andMe? Billy, yeah.
Ancestry.
AncestryDNA.com. Yeah, some of these are, there's 5 or 6 kind of big ones that everybody uses, and they're, they always rolling it. Everybody gets it for a Christmas present for some reason. I think it was kind of weird. I'm not sure why. Because you never know what you're going to find out. Like people find out all kinds of things that they didn't really want to know, that they won't share at the next Christmas. Okay, sorry. The way that these work is that they are taking a part of your individual genome, right? Everybody's genome is different, right? It's individual to you. Unless you have a twin, an identical twin, it's going to be different, right? So it immediately identifies you. If your DNA is out there someplace and, we can, you get a clean sample, you can identify it. I know it's you, right? Because there are going to be certain markers that are unique to you, right? Your family might share some things, but you are absolutely unique. What they do, though, is in the process of, and you can use the test to trace your matrilineal line, your patrilineal line, or autosomal DNA, which kind of looks at both sides of it. The science of it is, kind of complicated. It's essentially, are you using this to find, who's your daddy, or are you using this to find what kinship group do I belong to? And both of those things are possible. The reason that the result that you get, okay, so you're 29% this or 43% that, they're, again, categorization. They're splitting us up into little discrete entities. The reason they can say that is that they're taking your sample and they're comparing it to everybody else who's in their database, right? If their database is limited to, European descent, white Americans, then that test is going to look funny. That test is going to look different for you, right? If they're, that's why these tests change, right? So Oprah famously took the test, and 1 minute she's, got her origins in Southern Africa, and she gets all excited about it and starts sending money there. And then the next minute she's, West African or something like that. The tests change, the results of the tests change because the databases change, right? So what you're really getting is a statistical average based on the sample that this particular company has. And that's it. That's not really telling you very much. It's probably not telling you much more than you already know, unless you're adopted or unless you have some other kind of complication. You already know that your great-grandmother was Italian, right? You already know these things. So the point of this is to, the companies use this and people use these tests as a way of providing some kind of material reality, right? So grandmother said that, but I know I really am this particular thing. Okay, this is the problem with them. In addition to to me that they reiterate or recapitulate racial thinking, but they also have a privacy problem because that data does no longer belong to you. And I've been reading more about this than I should. This doesn't belong to you anymore. Moreover, these databases are not discrete from the criminal justice databases. CODIS, there's some overlap, right? Unless you can opt out and say, no, we don't want the police looking at that. It's like, well, good luck. Right? Maybe they'll do that and maybe they won't. I think there's reason, privacy advocates are rightly concerned about this because we don't have any control over it. We cannot control where this information, 23andMe hacked, right? So if your information was out there, somebody else can have it. And these are companies whose job it is to sell you something. And your data is now being used to do all kinds of other things. I'm not going down the paranoid road there because, the kind of tinfoil hat, because it's kind of scary. But that was kind of the big picture project of, and they're trying to figure out ways of using this information in classes so that when somebody asks, what's the difference between blood and DNA? I have a good answer. Pretty much it.